old, who gave us a good lead. He had seen the lights and he had identified them. Ever since he had read the story in the papers, he had been looking. One evening, he and his wife were in their yard looking for the lights. All of a sudden, 2 or 3 appeared. They were in view for several seconds, then they were gone. In a few minutes, the lights did a repeat performance. The man admitted he had been scared. He broke off his story of the lights and launched into his background as a native Texan with range wars, Indians, and stagecoaches under his belt. What he was trying to point out was that despite the range wars, Indians, and stagecoaches, he had been scared. His wife had been scared too. We had some difficulty getting back to the lights, but we finally made it. The third time they came around, he said, one of the lights emitted a sound. It said, "Plover." The old gentleman had immediately identified it as a plover, a water bird about the size of a quail. Later that night, and on several other occasions, they had seen the same thing. After a few more hair-raising but interesting stories of the old West Texas, we left. Our next stop was the Federal Game Warden's office in Lubbock. We got the lowdown on plovers. We explained our interest, and the warden was very helpful. He had been around West Texas all of his life, so he was familiar with wildlife. The oily white breast of a plover could easily reflect light, but plovers usually didn't travel in more than pairs, or 3 at the most. He had never seen or heard of them traveling in a flock of 15 to 30, but of course this wasn't impossible. Ducks, yes, but probably not plovers. He did say that for some unknown reason there were more than the usual number of plovers in the area that fall. I was anxious to get the negatives that Hart had lent us back to the photo lab at Wright Field, but I had one more call to make. I wanted to talk to the 2 ladies who had seen a strange object hovering near their car, but I also wanted to write my report before I left Lubbock. 2 Air Force special investigators from Reese Air Force Base offered to talk to the ladies, so I stayed at the air base and finished my report. That night, when the investigators came back, I got the story. They had spent the whole day talking to the ladies and doing a little discreet checking into their backgrounds. The 2 ladies, a mother and her daughter, had left their home in Matador, Texas, 70 miles northeast of Lubbock, about 12:30 p.m. on August 31st. They were driving along in their car when they suddenly noticed a pear-shaped object, about 150 yards ahead of them. It was just off the side of the road, about 120 feet in the air. It was drifting slowly to the east, less than the speed required to take off in a Cub airplane. They drove on down the road about 50 more yards, stopped, and got out of the car. The object, which they estimated to be the size of a B-29 fuselage, was still drifting along slowly. There was no sign of any exhaust blast, and they heard no noise, but they did see a porthole in the side of the object. In a few seconds, the object began to pick up speed and rapidly climb out of sight. As it climbed, it seemed to have a tight spiraling motion. The investigation showed that the 2 ladies were solid citizens with absolutely no talents or reasons for fabricating such a story. The daughter was fairly familiar with aircraft. Her husband was an Air Force officer, then in Korea, and she had been living near air bases for several years. The ladies had said that the object was drifting to the east, which possibly indicated that it was moving with the wind, but on further investigation, it was found that it was moving into the wind. The 2 investigators had worked all day and hadn't come up with the slightest indication of an answer. This added the final section to my now voluminous report on the Lubbock affair. The next morning, as I rode to the airport to catch an airliner back to Dayton, I tried to put the whole puzzle together. It was hard to believe that all we'd heard was real. Did a huge flying wing pass over Albuquerque and travel 250 miles to Lubbock in about 15 minutes? This would be about 900 miles per hour. Did the radar station in Washington pick up the same thing? I'd checked the distances on the big wall map in flight operations just before leaving Reese Air Force Base. It was 1,300 miles from Lubbock to the radar site. From talking to people, we decided that the lights were apparently still around Lubbock at 11:20 p.m., and the radar picked them up just after midnight. They would have had to be traveling about 780 miles per hour. This was fairly close to the 900 mile per hour speed clocked by the two radars. The photos of the Lubbock lights checked with the description of what the AEC employee and his wife had seen in Albuquerque. Nobody in Lubbock, however, had reported seeing a flying wing with lights. All of this was swimming around in my mind when I stepped out of the staff car at the Lubbock airport. My plane had already landed, so I checked in at the ticket counter, picked up a morning paper, and ran out and got into the airplane. I sat down in cowboy boots. I soon found out he was a retired rancher from Lubbock. On the front page of the paper was an account of a large meteor that had flashed across New Mexico, West Texas, and Oklahoma the night before. According to the newspaper account, it was very spectacular and had startled a good many people in Lubbock. I was interested in the story because I had seen this meteor. It was a spectacular sight, and I could easily understand how such things could be called UFOs. My seat partner must have noticed that I was reading the story of the meteor because he commented that a friend of his, the man who had brought him to the airport, had seen it. We talked about the meteor. This led to a discussion of other odd happenings and left a perfect opening for him to bring up the Lubbock lights. He asked me if I'd heard about them. I said that I had heard a few vague stories. I hoped that this would stave off any detailed accounts of stories I had been saturated with during the past 5 days, but it didn't. I heard all the details all over again. As he talked on, I settled back in my seat waiting for a certain thing to happen. Pretty soon it came. The rancher hesitated, and the tone of his voice changed to a half-proud, half-apologetic tone. I'd heard this transition many times in the past few months. He was going to tell about the UFO that he had seen. He was going to tell how he had seen the bluish-green lights. I was wrong. What he said knocked me out of my boredom. The same night that the college professors had seen their formation of lights, his wife had seen something. Nobody in Lubbock knew about the story, not even their friends. He didn't want anyone to think he and his wife were crazy. He was telling me only because I was a stranger. Just after dark, his wife had gone outdoors to take some sheets off the clothesline. He was inside the house reading the paper. Suddenly his wife had rushed into the house, as he told the story, as white as the sheet she was carrying. As close as he could remember, he said, this was about 10 minutes before the professors made their first sighting. He stopped at this point to tell me about his wife. She wasn't prone to be flighty, and she never made up tales. This character qualification was also standard for UFO storytellers. The reason his wife was so upset was that she had seen a large object glide swiftly and silently over the house. She said it looked like an airplane without a body. On the back edge of the wing were pairs of glowing, bluish lights. The Albuquerque sighting. He said he didn't have any idea what his wife had seen, but he thought that it was an interesting story. It was an interesting story. It hit me right between the eyes. I knew the rancher and his wife couldn't have possibly heard the Albuquerque couple's story. Only they and a few Air Force people knew about it. The chances of two identical stories being made up were infinitesimal, especially since neither of them fitted the standard Lubbock Light description. I wondered how many other people in Lubbock, Albuquerque, or anywhere in the Southwest had seen a similar UFO during this period and hesitated to mention it. I tried to get a few more facts from the rancher, but he'd told me all he knew. At Dallas, I boarded an airliner to Dayton, and he went on to Baton Rouge, never knowing what he'd added to the story of the Lubbock Lights. On the way to Dayton, I figured out a plan of attack on the thousands of words of notes I'd taken. The best thing to do, I decided, was to treat each sighting in the Lubbock Light series as a separate incident. All of them seemed to be dependent upon each other for importance. If the objects that were reported in several of the incidents could be identified, the rest would merely become average UFO reports. The photographs taken by Carl Hart Jr. became number one on the agenda. As soon as I reached Dayton, I took Hart's negatives to the Photo Reconnaissance Laboratory at Wright Field. This laboratory, staffed by the Air Force's top photography experts, did all of our analysis of photographs. They went right to work on the negatives and soon had a report. There had originally been 5 negatives, but when we asked to borrow them, Hart could only produce 4. The negatives were badly scratched and dirty because so many people had handled them, so it was difficult to tell the actual photographic images from the dust spots and scratches. The first thing that the lab did was to look at each spot on the negatives to see if it was an actual photographic image. They found that the photos showed an inverted V formation of lights. In each photo, the individual image of a light was badly blurred due to motion of the camera. But by careful scrutiny of each blurred image, they were able to determine that the original lights that Hart had photographed were circular, near pinpoint sources of light, like a bright star or a distant light bulb. Next, they made enlargements from the negatives and carefully plotted the position of each light in the formation. In each photograph, the individual lights in the formation shifted position according to a definite pattern. One additional factor that was brought out in the report was that although the photos were taken on a clear night, no images of the stars could be found in the background. This proved one thing: the lights, which were overexposed in the photograph, were a great deal brighter than the stars. Or the lights affected the film more than the light. Was all that the photos showed. It was impossible to determine the size of each image of the group, speed, or altitude. The next thing was to try to duplicate what Hart said he had done. I enlisted the aid of several friends, and we tried to photograph a moving light. When we were talking to Hart in Lubbock, he had taken us to his backyard.